They laughed and threw me out of the house I considered home. My father said, "This isn't yours. Get out before we call the police." Now they have 30 days left to laugh. Then the sheriff comes. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in this mess. My grandfather passed away 3 months ago, and honestly, it hit me harder than anyone else in the family. While my parents and aunts were busy arguing about who gets what at the funeral, I was the one sitting by his bedside during those final weeks. The old man had been my rock since I was 8 years old, when my parents basically dumped me at his place every summer because they couldn't handle having me around. Grandpa lived in this beautiful craftsman house in Sacramento that he bought back in 1987 for what would be pocket change today. 3 bedrooms, huge workshop in the back, and a kitchen that always smelled like his famous coffee cake. That house was more home to me than anywhere I'd ever lived. Every summer for 12 years, I'd spend 3 months there learning woodworking, helping him fix up the place, and listening to his stories about building half the furniture in that house with his own hands. The guy was old school in the best way possible. He'd wake up at 5 every morning, make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and head out to his workshop before the sun came up. I'd find him out there sanding some piece of furniture or building custom cabinets for neighbors. He taught me everything I know about working with my hands, and more importantly, he taught me what it meant to earn something through honest work. But here's where it gets interesting. My dad and his 2 sisters always treated Grandpa like he was just some old man sitting on valuable real estate. They'd visit maybe twice a year, usually around his birthday or Christmas, and spend the whole time making comments about how he should sell the house and move into assisted living. The conversations always went the same way. They'd hint around about how much the property was worth, suggest he was getting too old to maintain it, and basically treat him like he was already dead. Grandpa saw right through it. He'd tell me stories about how his own kids turned out to be vultures, more interested in his assets than his well-being. One evening, we were sitting on his back porch watching the sunset, and he said something that stuck with me. He looked around at his workshop, his garden, and the house he'd spent decades perfecting, and told me that real family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when life gets tough. That conversation happened about 2 years before he died, and I started noticing changes in how he talked about the future. He'd make comments about making sure the right person inherited his life's work. He'd point to different projects around the house and say things like how he hoped whoever ended up with the place would appreciate the craftsmanship. At the time, I figured he was just getting philosophical in his old age. When Grandpa got sick, I was the one who took time off work to drive him to doctor's appointments. I was the one who helped him organize his medications and made sure he was eating properly. My parents and aunts would call once a week to check in, but they were too busy with their own lives to actually help. During his final month, when he was in and out of hospital, I practically lived at his place to take care of the house and visit him every day. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect. My dad and his sisters put on a big performance about how much they loved him, complete with tears and speeches about what a wonderful father he was. But I noticed they spent more time talking to each other about practical matters than actually grieving. They were already making plans to clean out the house and get it ready to sell before we'd even left the cemetery. That's when things got weird. The day after the funeral, my dad called me up and told me to come by Grandpa's house to help sort through his belongings. I figured this was normal family stuff, dividing up his tools and personal items, maybe keeping some furniture that had sentimental value. I drove over there expecting to spend a few hours reminiscing and helping pack up his workshop. Instead, I walked into what felt like a hostile takeover. My parents and aunts had already moved a bunch of their stuff into the house. My mom was rearranging the kitchen like she owned the place, and my dad was in the living room measuring furniture to see what would fit in their current house versus what they'd sell. They weren't sorting through Grandpa's belongings. They were dividing up their inheritance. I asked my dad what was going on, and he gave me this look like I was stupid for not understanding. He explained that Grandpa had left the house to all 3 of his children, which meant my parents were now part owners of property. They decided to move in temporarily, while they figured out whether to sell it or rent it out. My aunts were taking turns staying there on weekends to help sort through decades of Grandpa's possessions. The whole situation felt wrong, but what really got to me was how they were treating the place. My mom was already talking about renovating the kitchen and getting rid of Grandpa's workshop to make room for a bigger garage. They were discussing the house like it was just a financial asset, not a home where someone had spent 35 years building a life. I mentioned that I'd always assumed I'd be able to stay there sometimes, maybe help maintain the workshop and keep Grandpa's memory alive. That's when my dad dropped the bomb that changed everything. He looked at me with this cold expression and said the house belonged to his generation now, not mine. He made it clear that I wasn't welcome to treat the place like my personal vacation home just because I'd spent summers there as a kid. The conversation got heated pretty quickly. I reminded him that I'd been the one taking care of Grandpa, that I'd spent more time in that house than any of them had in the past decade. My mom jumped in with some nonsense about how I was being selfish and needed to understand that family inheritance doesn't work the way I thought it did. She kept repeating that I was just a grandchild, not a direct heir. That's when my dad delivered the line that still makes my blood boil. He told me I needed to get my head out of clouds and accept reality. Then he said those words I mentioned at the beginning, that the house wasn't mine, never had been mine, and I needed to get out before they called the police for trespassing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These people had basically ignored Grandpa for years, showed up to grab their inheritance, and were now treating me like some kind of criminal for wanting to honor his memory. The worst part was how they laughed when I got upset. My aunt actually chuckled and said I was being dramatic, like my connection to that house and the Grandpa was just some childhood fantasy I needed to grow out of. I left that day feeling completely betrayed and confused. The people I had considered family had just kicked me out of the place I considered home. But as I drove away, something Grandpa used to say kept running through my head. He'd always told me that sometimes the people who smile in your face are the same ones who will stab you in the back when there's something valuable at stake. Little did they know, Grandpa had been a lot smarter than any of us realized. After getting kicked out of what I thought was my second home, I ended up renting this tiny trailer on the outskirts of town. The place was a dump, barely enough room to turn around, sketchy neighbors, and a landlord who probably hadn't updated anything since the Carter administration. But it was all I could afford on my construction worker salary, especially after taking all that unpaid time off to care for Grandpa. Those first few weeks were rough. I'd lie awake at night in that cramped trailer, going over every conversation I'd ever had with Grandpa about the house. The old man had definitely said things that suggested he had plans for me, but I started second-guessing myself. Maybe my family was right. Maybe I was just some delusional kid who'd built up a fantasy about inheriting his grandfather's house. But then I remembered something specific. About 18 months before Grandpa died, we'd been working on refinishing his dining room table, this gorgeous oak piece he'd built in the 70s. Out of nowhere, he started talking about how he'd been meeting with lawyers to get his affairs in order. He said something that seemed weird at the time. He was making sure his house went to someone who'd actually appreciate what he'd built. I kept replaying that conversation, and others like it. There was a time he'd pointed to his workshop and mentioned how he'd set things up so the vultures couldn't get their hands on his life's work. Another time, he'd made some comment about how blood doesn't always make family, and sometimes you have to get creative to make sure the right people inherit what matters. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Grandpa had done something my family didn't know about. So I started doing what any reasonable person would do. I began Googling everything I could about inheritance law in California. Turns out there are actually several ways to transfer property that bypass traditional wills, and some of them are pretty sneaky. That's when I learned about something called a transfer on death deed, or TOD deed. Basically, it's a legal document that lets you transfer real estate to someone automatically when you die, without going through probate or even mentioning it in your will. The current owner keeps full control of the property while they're alive, but the moment they pass away, boom, the deed transfers to whoever they named. The genius part is that these deeds are filed with the county recorder's office, but they're not exactly advertised. Your family could have no idea you'd sign one unless they specifically went looking for it. And why would they? If Grandpa had a regular will that left everything to his kids, they'd never think to check if he'd also filed transfer deeds for specific properties. I spent my lunch breaks at the local library researching how to search property records in Sacramento County. Their website has this public records database where you can look up any property by address and see all the recorded documents associated with it. It took me a while to figure out the system, but eventually I found Grandpa's house and started scrolling through decades of paperwork. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. The original purchase deed from 1987, some refinancing documents, permits for various home improvements over the years. But then, buried in a list of recordings from about 14 months ago, I saw something that made my heart stop. Transfer on death deed, beneficiary deed. I clicked on that document so fast, I nearly broke my phone screen. And there it was, in black and white legal language that was beautiful in its simplicity. My grandfather had filed a transfer on death deed naming me as the sole beneficiary of his house. The document was properly notarized, filed with all the right signatures, and recorded in the official county records. I sat there in that library staring at my phone, feeling like I just won the lottery and gotten punched in the stomach at the same time. Grandpa had kept his word. He really had made sure I'd inherit the house. But that meant my family had either never bothered to check the property records, or they'd somehow missed this document entirely when they were sorting out his estate. The paperwork showed that Grandpa had used a lawyer named Robert Campbell to handle the transfer deed. I remember Mr. Campbell. He was this old-school lawyer who'd handled various legal stuff for Grandpa over the years. They'd been friends since the 80s, and Grandpa always said Campbell was one of the few honest lawyers left in California. I called Campbell's office that same afternoon, and when I explained who I was, his secretary put me right through. Campbell sounded genuinely surprised to hear from me, and when I mentioned the transfer on death deed, there was this long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, he asked me if my family had been in contact with him about the estate. When I told him they hadn't, Campbell got very quiet. He explained that after Grandpa died, he'd been expecting someone from a family to call about the house transfer, since the deed would have automatically taken effect upon Grandpa's death. He'd even prepared some paperwork to help facilitate the transition, but when nobody contacted him, he figured the family was handling everything through another attorney. Campbell asked me to come to his office the next day to discuss the situation. He said there were some important details I needed to understand about how transfer on death deeds work, and some steps I need to take to formally claim the property. He also mentioned that the fact my family had moved into the house without checking property records could complicate things legally. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how my dad had looked at me when he told me the house wasn't mine, how my mom had laughed when I got upset about being kicked out. They'd been so confident, so smug about their legal right to inherit Grandpa's property. The idea that they might have been completely wrong this whole time was almost too good to believe. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to Campbell's office in downtown Sacramento. The guy was exactly how I remembered him, probably in his 70s, wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than my truck, but with this warm grandfather-type personality that made you trust him instantly. Campbell pulled out a thick file labeled with Grandpa's name and started explaining the situation. Apparently, Grandpa had been very specific about his intentions when he'd set up the transfer on death deed. He'd told Campbell that he wanted to make sure his house went to the person who'd actually been like family to him, not just the people who happened to share his DNA. The lawyer explained that transfer on death deeds are completely legal in California and take precedence over provisions for the specific property they cover. Since Grandpa's regular will left his general estate to his 3 children, but the house had a specific TOD deed naming me as beneficiary, I was now the legal owner of the property regardless of what the will said. But here's where it got interesting. Campbell said that technically, the house had transferred to me the moment Grandpa died 3 months ago. My family had been living there illegally this whole time, essentially as squatters on my property. He said I had every right to evict them immediately, and could even potentially sue them for any damage they'd caused or rent they should have been paying. The old lawyer smiled when he saw the expression on my face. He said Grandpa had anticipated this exact scenario, and had left specific instructions about how to handle it if the family tried to take over the house without checking the property records first. Turns out my grandfather had planned for this confrontation all along, and he'd given me every legal tool I needed to get my house back. Campbell leaned back in his leather chair and pulled out another folder from Grandpa's file. He told me that when Grandpa had set up the transfer on death deed, He'd also prepaid for legal services to help me handle any family disputes that might arise. The old man had literally budgeted for a family war over his house, and he'd made sure I had professional backup. The lawyer walked me through exactly what needed to happen. Since the house had legally transferred to me when Grandpa died, I needed to file an affidavit with the county recorder's office to officially claim the property. Then I'd need to get new title insurance and formally evict my family if they refused to leave voluntarily. Campbell said he'd handle all the paperwork and court filings. Grandpa had already paid for everything. I asked Campbell if there was any chance my family could fight this in court. He chuckled and said they were welcome to try, but transfer on death deeds are pretty bulletproof when they're filed correctly. The only way they could challenge it would be to prove that Grandpa was mentally incompetent when he signed it, or that someone had coerced him. Given that he'd filed it over a year before his death and had medical records showing he was sharp as a tack, good luck with that. We spent the next hour going over strategy. Campbell suggested I give my family one chance to leave voluntarily before starting formal eviction proceedings. Not because I owed them anything, but because it would look better to a judge if they tried to claim I was being vindictive. He drafted a letter explaining the legal situation and giving them 30 days to vacate the property. The best part was watching Campbell write that letter. The 70-year-old lawyer was clearly enjoying himself, crafting legal language that was polite on the surface, but absolutely devastating underneath. He kept muttering things like, "Oh, they're going to hate this part," while typing up sections about potential damages and illegal occupation of the property. I decided to deliver the letter in person rather than having it mailed. I wanted to see their faces when they realized how badly they'd screwed up. Campbell thought this was a terrible idea from a legal standpoint, but he could tell I was going to do it anyway. He made me promise to bring a witness and not get into any physical confrontations that might hurt my case later. So I called my buddy Mike, who's built like a linebacker and works security at the casino. I explained the situation and asked if he wanted to watch some family drama unfold. Mike was all over it. He'd never liked my dad anyway, ever since the barbecue where my father had made some snarky comments about Mike's job not being real work. We drove over to Grandpa's house that Saturday morning. My parents' cars were in the driveway, and I could see through the window that they were having coffee in the kitchen like they owned the place. My stomach was doing backflips, but I was also angrier than I'd ever been in my life. These people had treated me like garbage, and now I was about to drop a legal bomb on their perfect little inheritance fantasy. I knocked on the front door of my own house. My mom answered, and her face immediately went sour when she saw me. She asked what I wanted, and I told her I needed to speak with her and my dad about an important legal matter regarding the property. She reluctantly let Mike and me into the living room, calling for my dad to come downstairs. My dad appeared looking annoyed, like I was interrupting his weekend with some petty nonsense. My aunts were there too, sitting around the dining room table with a bunch of paperwork spread out, probably planning renovations or calculating sale prices. The whole scene made me even more determined to wipe those smug expressions off their faces. I handed my dad Campbell's letter and told him he needed to read it carefully. He glanced at it dismissively at first, probably expecting some whiny complaint about hurt feelings. But as he read through the legal language, I watched his expression change from irritation to confusion to something approaching panic. My mom kept asking what was wrong, and finally my dad just read sections of the letter out loud. The room got very quiet as the implications sank in. Campbell had laid out the situation in devastating detail. The transfer on death deed, the fact that I was a legal owner of the house, their status as trespassers, and a 30-day notice to vacate. My Aunt Susan was the first one to speak up. She said there was no way this could be real, that Grandpa would never have done something like this without telling his own children. She kept insisting it had to be some kind of mistake or fraud. My dad was frantically calling someone on his phone, probably their family lawyer. I let them panic for a few minutes before explaining that I'd already verified everything with the county records office and Campbell's law firm. I told them that Campbell had a complete file of Grandpa's instructions, and that the old man had specifically anticipated this exact scenario. The look of betrayal on my dad's face was almost worth all the pain they put me through. That's when things got really ugly. My mom started yelling about how ungrateful I was, how they had taken care of Grandpa's funeral expenses and house maintenance, and how I was destroying the family over money. My dad joined in, saying I was being manipulated by a greedy lawyer who was probably lying about the whole thing. But the best reaction came from my Aunt Linda. She actually accused me of forging legal documents and threatened to call the police. I told her go ahead. I'd be happy to show the officers my property deed and have them explain trespassing laws to her. Mike was trying not to laugh at this point, and I was feeling more confident than I'd felt in months. The conversation went in circles for about an hour. They alternated between denying the documents were real, claiming Grandpa had been manipulated into signing them, and trying to guilt-trip me into letting them stay in the house. At one point, my dad offered to buy me out for what he called fair market value for my share, completely missing the point that I owned the entire house, not just a portion of it. Finally, I'd had enough. I told them they had 30 days to get out, exactly as the letter specified. If they weren't gone by then, Campbell would file formal eviction proceedings and potentially sue them for damages. I mentioned that they'd been living in my house rent-free for 3 months, and that a judge might be very interested in calculating what they owed me for that. As Mike and I were leaving, my dad made one last desperate attempt to guilt me into backing down. He said that Grandpa would be ashamed of me for turning against my own family, and that I was dishonoring his memory by being so vindictive. I turned around and told him that Grandpa had specifically planned for the situation because he knew exactly what kind of people they were. The drive home was surreal. Mike kept congratulating me and saying he'd never seen anything like it, but I felt emotionally drained. Part of me was thrilled that I'd finally gotten some justice, but another part was sad that it had come to this. These were people I'd grown up thinking of as family, and now we were in a legal war that was going to destroy any relationship we had left. But then I remembered how they'd laughed when they kicked me out of Grandpa's house, how they'd treated his workshop like it was just wasted space, how they'd made it clear that I wasn't really family when there was money involved. Grandpa had seen all of this coming, and he'd made sure I had the tools to fight back. The next 30 days were going to be very interesting. The 30 days that followed were absolutely wild. My family went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of grief, except instead of accepting death, they were trying to accept that they'd lost a house worth probably $400,000 to the grandson they treated like garbage. First came denial. My dad hired some lawyer who charged him $300 an hour to tell him exactly what Campbell had already explained, that transfer on death deeds are completely legal and binding in California. The guy apparently spent a week trying to find some loophole or procedural error that would invalidate Grandpa's deed, but came up empty. Then came anger. My mom started calling me every few days, screaming about how I was destroying the family and how Grandpa would roll over in his grave if he knew what I was doing. She kept insisting that I was being manipulated by Campbell, who she claimed was probably getting some kind of kickback from selling the house. The irony was completely lost on her. My aunts got in on the action, too. Aunt Susan showed up at my trailer one evening, crying and begging me to reconsider. She said they'd already put deposits down on renovations and that this was going to bankrupt them. I reminded her that they'd never asked my permission before planning to gut Grandpa's workshop and that their financial problems weren't my responsibility. The bargaining phase was actually pretty entertaining. My dad offered to let me live in the house rent-free if I'd sign the deed over to the family. When that didn't work, he suggested we could all share the property somehow, maybe turn it into some kind of family compound. He even offered to pay me $100,000 cash to walk away, apparently not understanding that the house was worth way more than that. But my favorite attempt at negotiation came from my Aunt Linda. She actually suggested that I could have Grandpa's workshop and tool collection if I let them keep the house. She said it with a straight face, like she was doing me some huge favor by offering to let me keep the one part of property I actually cared about. The woman genuinely didn't understand that I already owned all of it. Depression set in around day 25. My mom stopped calling, and when I drove by the house, I could see them boxing up their belongings. My dad looked like he'd aged 10 years, and I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then I remembered how he'd laughed when he told me to get out before they called the police. Campbell had been keeping me updated on the legal side of things. He'd filed all the necessary paperwork to establish my ownership and had prepared eviction documents in case my family didn't leave voluntarily. He seemed genuinely impressed by how cleanly Grandpa had set everything up and mentioned that he'd handled thousands of estate cases, but had never seen someone plan for family conflict quite so thoroughly. The final showdown came on day 31. I'd given him an extra day out of what I told myself was generosity, but really I was just nervous about the confrontation. Campbell met me at the house along with a sheriff's deputy who specialized in evictions. I'd also brought Mike again, because if things got ugly, I wanted someone there who could handle my dad if he lost his temper. The scene was exactly what you'd expect, and somehow worse at the same time. My parents and aunts were standing in the driveway with a moving truck, looking absolutely defeated. They had that hollow-eyed expression you see on people who've lost everything to a natural disaster, except in this case the disaster was their own greed and stupidity. My mom was crying quietly, which honestly was the hardest part for me. I'd been expecting more anger and defiance, but instead she just looked broken. She kept staring at the house like she was trying to memorize it, and I realized that in her mind, she'd probably already been planning her retirement in that place. My dad tried one last time to guilt me into changing my mind. He said I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that family was more important than money, and that I'd regret this decision for the rest of my days. The deputy told him he needed to finish loading his belongings and clear the property, or he'd be arrested for trespassing. Aunt Susan was furious in a way that was almost impressive. She kept muttering about how she was going to contest the deed in court, how she'd hire a better lawyer, how there had to be some way to prove that Grandpa hadn't been in his right mind. Campbell quietly mentioned that challenging the mental competency of someone 14 months after they'd filed legal documents was nearly impossible, especially since Grandpa had medical records proving his cognitive health right up until his final illness. The weirdest part was watching them load the moving truck with stuff that had belonged to Grandpa. My mom had packed up his coffee maker, his favorite armchair, even some of his tools from the workshop. I had to keep reminding myself that legally, everything in that house belonged to me now, including all of Grandpa's personal belongings. I decided to let them take the personal items. Not because I was being generous, but because I could see how devastated they were, and some part of me still remembered when these people had felt like family. Campbell advised against it from a legal standpoint, but I told him I didn't want Grandpa's coffee maker badly enough to fight about it. The sheriff's deputy was actually pretty cool about the whole situation. He clearly handled plenty of family disputes over inheritances, and he seemed to understand that everyone involved was going through genuine emotional trauma. He made sure my family had enough time to finish packing, but also made it clear that they needed to be completely off the property by sunset. As the moving truck pulled away, my dad rolled down his window and said something that still gives me chills. He told me that I'd won this battle, but that I'd lost my family forever. He said that Grandpa had turned me into exactly the kind of person he'd always complained about, someone who valued money more than relationships. I wanted to tell him that this wasn't about money. It was about respect, that they'd show me exactly how much our family relationship was worth when they kicked me out of the house I'd grown up in, that Grandpa had seen their true nature and had taken steps to protect someone who'd actually loved him. But instead, I just watched them drive away. Mike patted me on the shoulder and said something about how I'd handled things better than he would have. Campbell shook my hand and gave me the keys to my own front door, keys that my family had changed 3 months earlier to keep me out. As I walked into the house for the first time as its legal owner, I felt a mixture of triumph and sadness that I'm still trying to process. I'd gotten justice, but at the cost of burning down every family relationship I'd ever had. But then I walked into Grandpa's workshop and saw all his tools exactly where he'd left them. I found a note he'd written to me, tucked under his favorite hand plane where he knew I'd eventually find it. The note was short, but it changed everything about how I viewed what had just happened. The note from Grandpa was written in his careful handwriting on a piece of his workshop stationery. It was dated about 6 months before he died, which meant he'd hidden it there knowing that someday I'd be working in his shop and would find it when I reached for that particular tool. The message was vintage Grandpa, direct and wise in that way that only comes from decades of dealing with difficult people. He wrote that if I was reading this note, It meant his plan had worked and the vultures had shown their true colors. He said he was proud that I'd fought for what was rightfully mine and that I shouldn't feel guilty about choosing justice over fake family harmony. But the part that really got to me was the last paragraph. Grandpa wrote that he hoped I'd use the house not just as a place to live, but as a workshop for building the kind of life he'd always wanted for me. He said the property was his investment in my future, and that he trusted me to honor his memory by creating something meaningful with the opportunity he'd given me. That note changed my entire perspective on what had happened. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle or getting revenge on family members who treated me badly. Grandpa had seen potential in me that even I didn't recognize, and he'd structured his final years around giving me the foundation I'd need to build something real. The first few months of living in the house alone were honestly pretty lonely. I'd gotten so used to the chaos of family drama that the silence felt weird. But slowly, I started making the place my own. I kept Grandpa's furniture in the main rooms because it felt right, but I updated the kitchen and turned one of the spare bedrooms into a proper home office. The workshop became my sanctuary. I started refinishing furniture in my spare time, partly as a way to feel connected to Grandpa, and partly because I'd always enjoyed working with my hands. What began as a hobby quickly turned into something more serious when neighbors started asking me to restore family pieces or build custom cabinets. Within 6 months, I had enough side work to quit my construction job and run a full-time woodworking business out of Grandpa's workshop. I kept his old workbench exactly as he'd left it, but added modern equipment and better lighting. The space that my family had wanted to tear down and turn into a garage became the foundation of my new career. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had seen the house as valuable real estate to be sold for maximum profit, but I was using it as the base for building actual wealth through skilled work. Grandpa had always said that property was only as valuable as what you did with it, and I was finally understanding what he meant. Campbell became something of a mentor during this transition. He'd stop by occasionally to check on how I was adjusting, and he'd share stories about Grandpa that I'd never heard before. Apparently, the old man had talked about me constantly during their legal meetings, always emphasizing how proud he was of my work ethic and character. The lawyer also helped me understand the full scope of what Grandpa had done. The transfer on death deed was just one part of a comprehensive estate plan designed to bypass my parents and aunts entirely. Grandpa had also set up a small trust fund to help with property taxes and maintenance costs, ensuring that I'd never have to sell the house due to financial pressure. About 8 months after the eviction, I got my first contact from family members. It started with a text from my cousin Sarah, who'd always been pretty cool but had stayed out of the inheritance drama. She said she missed our conversations and wondered if we could grab coffee sometime to talk things over. Sarah was honest about why she was reaching out. She said the family was still angry and hurt, but that some of them were starting to realize they'd handled the situation badly. She didn't apologize for their behavior, but she acknowledged that they'd made assumptions about Grandpa's intentions without bothering to check the legal reality. We had a good conversation, and Sarah became the bridge that eventually led to limited contact with some other family members. Not my parents or aunts. That relationship was probably destroyed permanently, but some of the cousins and their kids started visiting occasionally. They were curious about what I'd done with Grandpa's workshop and impressed by the furniture business I'd built. The most surprising reconciliation came from my Uncle Tom, my dad's younger brother, who'd always been the black sheep of the family. Tom had stayed out of the inheritance fight entirely, but he'd heard about my woodworking business and wanted to see what I was doing with Grandpa's tools. Tom turned out to be a natural salesman, and he started referring high-end clients to me for custom furniture pieces. He said he'd always felt guilty about how the family had treated me, and this was his way of making amends. Within a year, those referrals had turned my hobby business into something genuinely profitable. I also started dating again, which had been impossible during the chaos of the legal battle. There's something about owning your own home and running your own business that makes you more confident in relationships. I met Jennifer at a farmer's market, where I'd set up a booth to display some of my furniture pieces. Jennifer was a teacher who'd been looking for someone to build custom bookshelves for her classroom. We ended up talking for 2 hours about wood grains and joinery techniques, and I realized I found someone who appreciated craftsmanship the way Grandpa had taught me to value it. She moved in about a year later, and Grandpa's house became our house. The really satisfying part came about 18 months after the eviction, when I learned what had happened to my parents and aunts. Sarah told me they'd had to downsize significantly after losing what they'd assumed would be their inheritance windfall. My dad had to postpone his retirement, and my mom had to go back to work part-time to help cover their mortgage. I won't lie, there was definitely some schadenfreude in hearing about their financial struggles. These were people who'd kicked me out of my grandfather's house and laughed about it. So I wasn't exactly heartbroken to learn that their greed had backfired. But mostly I just felt relieved that I'd never have to depend on them for anything again.